Hello and welcome to Witch Please, a fortnightly podcast about the Harry Potter world. I'm your erstwhile tech support, Trevor Chow-Fraser. Today's episode was recorded live at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. That's where Hannah and Marcelle teamed up with experimental college professor Lydia Brown to discuss representations of disability, queerness, and race in the Harry Potter world. Now, Marcelle asked me to add a quick note on sound quality. Our organizers ordered a soundboard, but it never came. Instead, we had to rig up a solution with our own gear. Now, live recordings are always a bit rough, so please forgive the stickier parts of this episode. And without further ado, here's the panel.
Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Elise.
And welcome. Thank you all for coming. The people on this panel can introduce themselves in a moment, but we just wanted to thank a few people before we got started, or groups, rather.
Yeah, so the Tufts Podcast Network is putting this event on and have done a lot of really good work to bring all of these beautiful people here and make sure they get paid for their time. So yay, Tufts Podcast. Woo!
Also, huge shout out to the Tufts Women's Center and LGBT Center for helping us pay for food and giving us plates and things to eat it off of. So yeah, thanks to them.
Yeah. And we also have, if you feel so inclined about the food or the panel, and if you have the resources, we have a makeshift donations bucket. All the donations are going to Standing Rock. So if you feel so inclined, put some money in the bucket. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Yay.
Yeah, have a great night.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah McGregor, and I am one half of the podcast Witch Please.
Hello, my name is Marcelle Cosman, and I am the other half of the podcast Witch Please.
And I am Lydia Brown. I am teaching in the X College, the class Rethinking Disability from Public Policy to Social Movements, and I think there are a few of my students here. I also currently have a very soaked through sock, and I'm unhappy about this fact.
So first off, I think would all like to thank Emma and Elise for putting this together. It's an absolute delight to have been invited to come and speak with you all, and to have the opportunity to meet Lydia and share some ideas. I'm having that thing where I keep forgetting that this microphone doesn't amplify me. It just feels like it should be making me louder, but it's not. We're recording this for the podcast. So the format that this is going to take, that we discussed in advance, is we're going to spend some time as a panel having a collective conversation, particularly about disability and queerness in Harry Potter. And then whenever we get bored of talking to each other, we are going to open it up to the floor and get you to join in the conversation. At that point, one of the two recorders that we're working with is going to head out into the group of you. If you would like to ask a question, but you don't want to be recorded, that is totally fine. Just say no thank you when the recorder makes its way to you. You can still ask us a question without your voice being on the podcast, but it's nice. Listeners like to, hear you. Okay, that was the business portion of the evening. All right, yeah, let's do this. I would like to sort of throw things over to Lydia to start with, because when Emma and Elise sent us out an email saying, this is sort of what I think the conversation should be about, Lydia immediately had so many interesting, exciting things to talk about, particularly about representations of neurodivergent characters in the Harry Potter world. And the first point that you made in the email you sent us was that you were interested in reading Hermione and Luna Lovegood as autistic characters. I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. I'm also in law school, and in law school, we have the phenomenon called cold calling, which probably only Hermione would actually enjoy, and nobody else would ever enjoy it, and nobody does. In law school, some people refer to being in your first year as the 1L terror shits, because at any time in your class of 100 people, the professor may call upon you and ask you to tell everything about the case in front of everybody, and you'll never know it's coming until after it's happened to you, unless you have a nicer professor. So I'm used to that. Sort of.
Am I being too professorial?
It's fine.
It's your point.
Yeah, no, one of the common practices in autistic community and online culture for a very long time now has been looking to see characters that look like us, that sound like us, that move like us. And many people who are well-known autistic bloggers, people who aren't well-known bloggers but are very much in conversation around autistic culture, will go through any book series, any movie series, and pull out the characters that, whether named explicitly or not, and usually the characters that are not named explicitly, that are like us. Because something that you pointed out, I think, in your email back to me, I think it was you, that it's not unique to Harry Potter, but oftentimes the characters that are explicitly labeled autistic by the author, they are canon autistic, this character is supposed to be someone on the spectrum, are written horrifically. They're written as a collection of bad stereotypes. They're not a relatable person. And you know that what they came from was the author saying, my research is, I looked up a diagnostic list of symptoms of autism, a very medicalized, pathologized definition, and said, okay, if the symptoms of autism are deficient social interaction, eye contact avoidance, perseveration on a topic that nobody cares about, and inability to form relationships, then all you've done is created a character that is a collection of deficits, which is a character that is a reflection back to the audience of what the audience already perceives autistic people to be. And so the characters that are not labeled explicitly as autistic are the ones that are often much more recognizable, that when we read, watch, or hear them, we are thinking, that person is like me. The way people respond to this character is like me. The way this character acts is like me. And so for Hermione, who is much more a topic of this conversation than Luna, that comes into play because she's the one who everyone writes off as the know-it-all, as obnoxious, as not understanding the social cues that other people expect her to have. And in a medicalized framing, right, that would be portrayed as she has a deficit socially, or she has all of the intellectual capability, but none of the social cognitive capability. But from an autistic culture perspective, all of that means is that she exists as a minority, neurologically, a neurominority, around people who don't share her way of existing in the world. And that looks like being a know-it-all. It looks like someone who doesn't socially fit in. It looks like someone who, in the first couple of movies, as the portrayal physically, someone whose hair is more unkempt and frizzy, somebody who isn't conforming to conventional beauty standards, even if their body might still fall in line with conventional beauty standards. But as far as how they keep themselves looking. For characters like Luna Lovegood, where there's less discussion, it's everything from how she starts talking when other people don't realize she intended to have a conversation with them, to how she perceives the world in a way that is fundamentally different from everybody else around her, and how everybody else assumes, and it's even her name, the word Luna, she's crazy. Luna, from the very patriarchal ableist idea that women, or people who are assumed to be women, are necessarily going to be more mentally unstable because of our cycles of ovulation. That if you're menstruating at a particular time, then you have less capability to control yourself. The idea of women as neurotic or hysterical, it's literally embodied in her name, and usually in conversation, that's what I hear from people is, oh, she's this crazy person. She's kind of naive. She's not a bad person, but she's crazy. Yeah. She's out of touch with reality. And for me, as an autistic and multiply disabled person, I read Luna as potentially autistic, potentially psych disabled, maybe both. I don't think that those things have to be mutually exclusionary either. And it's fascinating and it's fulfilling to be able to look into literature and look for characters that might be like you when it's explicitly labeled. It's nothing like who you are. It does not match up to your experiences. And when you're somebody like me occupying a place of both a lot of privilege and a lot of marginalization, it's exciting when I can encounter anybody in fiction that seems to remind me of myself. And that's a lot of what the autistic community finds when looking to identify which characters actually resonate with us. And sometimes it's not even a hunt, right? It just happens. Yeah. You get into a series and partway in, you realize, wait, this character is just like me. How has nobody else talked about this? And you go online and you find out your whole community has. And you're thinking, oh my God, holy fuck, I'm not alone. It's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah. That's what I feel like. I'm a former English professor now. I teach something else now, but as a former English professor, we spend a lot of time discouraging students from talking about literature as what's the word that I'm looking for? Not recognizable. Like recognizing yourself in your text, right? Relatable. That's the one. The great scourge of relatability, right? Everybody, like you always say to your students when they're like, I love this character, they're so relatable. And you're like, okay, well actually, like literature's supposed to be a way to sort of enter into life experiences that are not your own. So stop picking out only the characters that are just like you. And that is something that I think I at least have spent a lot of time teaching global literatures to like white kids from Alberta and being like, actually, you need to find the characters who aren't relatable. You need to find the ones who freak you out and think about those characters. But the dismissal of relatability is also something that's coming from a position of privilege, right? That there is something incredibly powerful about finding a relatable character when you occupy a position where you are assumed to not be a relatable subject, where you are, somebody who doesn't see yourself represented in the world.
And that's especially true when we talk about disability, and in particular neurodivergence and mental disability, because part of the definition and how mental disability is constructed is the idea that if you're mentally disabled, you're not knowable as a subject. That if you're mentally disabled, you're fundamentally confused, you're unable to relate to other people, you are unable to process the world around you or even recognize that the other people in the room are people and are human beings and exist. This is one of the core ableist tenets of the definition of autism, the idea that autistic people lack theory of mind. Theory of mind is a concept. It's not a debunked concept. It is when it's applied to autistic people. But what it means is the ability to understand that you folks in the audience, right, my brain's not the same as yours. My experience is not the same as yours. That even my perception of the room, I'm looking at all of your faces, looking at me, and you're looking up and seeing the three of us. Just our literal visual perception, for those of you that are sighted, is not the same. That's what theory of mind means. And theory of mind, as applied to neurodivergent, autistic, other mentally disabled people, says we don't have the ability to recognize that other people exist or have thoughts or feelings. And so if we don't, then how could anybody understand that we do? And I will say that one parallel I've drawn in my own experience as a neurodivergent person who's also queer and genderqueer, a parallel is that queer kids, trans kids, and disabled kids often grow up isolated. We often grow up isolated. We may or may not have relatives who are out, also known to be disabled, known to be queer, known to be trans. There may or may not be a few other kids in school. There may be someone down the block, rumors about somebody, a relative that no one wants to talk about, somebody who's not in your church anymore, not in your synagogue or your masjid anymore. But we grow up isolated. The difference for me has been that as a queer person, there was an established queer community when I got to college. There was no established disability community. And in both queer spaces and disability spaces and trans spaces, right, we're fighting for recognition. So the idea of relatability, how it maps upon disabled and neurodivergent people is very much in this. There's almost no disabled characters in literature that are written as relatable people. Yeah. We're written as props right? And I mean, this is true in some of the other examples that I'd pulled out and identified for you, like in Neville Longbottom's parents, we see them very, very briefly, and it's just said to us as a fact. We're supposed to accept it as a foundational fact. They went crazy. Yeah. That like they were tortured way too much. By the Death Eaters, and as a result, they lost their minds, and now they're stuck in St. Mungo's, and they will never get out.
And they're only a narrative device, right? They're there to signify the tragedy that is Neville's life.
Right, and that Neville has a terrible childhood.
Yeah, like, oh, it's so sad because of what has happened to them, but they themselves don't have interiority or, presence outside of that narrative function.
Or that what's tragic about it is they had these wonderful lives as Aurors, and now, to use the ableist language, they're basically vegetables. This is the ableist language. Now they don't exist as human beings. Yeah.
That's a wonderful scene for unpacking that in the text, though, too, right? Because that moment in St. Mungo's, we see Neville being taken to visit his parents. We get the sense that he doesn't get to visit his parents that much. And we see that moment where his mother has given him a small token. Do you remember what it is, Marcelle?
It's a candy wrapper.
Thank you. She gives him this candy wrapper, and then his grandmother takes it away, right? And so there's just...
His grandmother tells him to throw it away. He keeps it.
Correct. It's kind of a brief textual moment that gestures towards there being something more happening in that relationship that our narrator can't perceive, but that might be sort of present under the surface, like some sort of real emotionally resonant relationship between Neville and his parents that's just not available to us. There's something in that scene.
Yeah, I think that a generous reading of that would be that there is a kind of interiority that we don't have access to, but that we can imagine into it. And that the author puts that in place for us so that we can read it. She puts in place for us these signposts so that we can see that there is a rich backstory there. But then the resistant reading is that that's insufficient, because it shouldn't be the job of people who have disabilities and people who are allied with those who have disabilities to read for those signposts and create those worlds, because they're not provided there. And what happens, I think, a lot of the time is that people with neurotypical abilities will read those things and move on. So you don't even read them as signposts to another richer backstory. You read those as like, oh, Neville has crazy parents, and poor Neville, he keeps a candy wrapper because he doesn't have any other way to connect with his mother. When that's there. I feel that I have made my point on that. Yeah.
And the degree to which Neville is parallel to Harry as being somebody who is parentless, right? Also undermines the thing I just said. That's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, like the notion that Neville is parentless even though his parents are alive and well. They're just not, like, mentally equivalent to other parents who are alive and well. Yeah,
and that's exactly the essence of the ableism, is that if somebody has a mental disability, they are in fact not really a person. This is the core of the work that I do on combating ableism and understanding it as a kind of oppression, right? Is oppression dehumanizes its subject. Oppression says this person, their body, their existence is a site for violence, because this person needs to be rendered legible within normative embodiment. So in other words, in plain language, this person can't exist the way they are. They have to be forced to conform or assimilate into the dominant culture. Whether that person is Black, Indigenous, Latinx, or other person of color, having to conform into whiteness. This is the history I have, the contours of my body as an East Asian person in a white supremacist society, is that I get to be treated as a human, or almost like a real person, if I can take on the trappings of whiteness. That's where the myth of the model minority comes from. And this is something that I don't think, in a lot of critique that I've heard about Harry Potter's depiction of eugenics and of racial politics and the parallels that are drawn between Hitler's Third Reich and Nazi Germany, I don't think pick up on the complex layers of racial politics in the Harry Potter universe. Everything from not just, are you a pureblood wizard versus a mudblood, as the slur goes, but why is it that all of the elves are written in a particular category, as one category? Why are the centaurs put off into a separate category of their own? Like, and in, I've heard criticisms of other high fantasy, which is not the same thing as Harry Potter, but of other high fantasy in which non-human races are really just projections of a white vision to what Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color are like. Whether that is someone that's the Indigenous person being exotified, or the East Asian person treated as this foreign other, or the Black person and being rendered through the lens of anti-Blackness. And in understanding the non-personhood that happens when disability is inscribed in somebody, what happens to Neville's parents, Alice and Frank, it's that ableism and any other form of oppression that targets the body, like, they have to exist together. You can't have the racism of, oh, the elves aren't smart enough to exist on their own as independent creatures. They have to be tied as servants, basically as slaves, to the humans, to the human wizards, because they don't have the same level of intelligence. And that mirrors in the real world how ableism and racism play together. And like what you just pointed out with, why is it that the neurodivergent and the disabled people are the ones who are saying, let's look at this gesture and let's create this world within it to understand what it could represent? Why is it the people of color who might be pointing out, oh, part of the narrative is that elves have a particular aptitude for very powerful magic, but it is constrained because of their enslavement, because of their de facto enslavement? Why is it that more or less people of color are the ones who might point out there is another potential for a resistant narrative right there?
So we have talked a handful of times in the podcast about the problems with using non-human magical creatures as allegories for very real life human crises, and particular, or like forms of oppression and forms of violence that affect non-white people in the real world. And one of the things that I think is really worth putting pressure on when we talk about this, when we talk about Harry Potter in particular, and its usefulness in the ways that it sort of teaches bracket white, able-bodied, neurotypical, close bracket readers about how other people are people, is that Harry Potter isn't high fantasy. It takes place ostensibly in the real world, just in a magical corner of the real world. So when we use non-human beings as allegories for things that affect real human beings, essentially what we're saying is that the implication is that those real human beings are less human, and the only way that we can understand their experiences is by transposing them onto creatures for whom we can pity. And that implicitly also, at the same time, in the Harry Potter wizarding world, these other real human people are not experiencing the kinds of oppression and violence that exist in our real world. And we can believe that because it's not talked about. And because it's not talked about, it must not be happening, and so on.
I mean, even when you think about the racial representation of the human characters in both the books and the movies, there's like 1,000,001 layers of problem. There's why is Hogwarts so fucking white?
Like, why does it to no degree represent the actual makeup of the UK as a country? It's the one wizarding school.
And
It's a real question.
I'm currently blanking on their names, but there's only a handful of characters, and their names are right there.
There's Cho Chang, right? The very embarrassing character with 2 last names. There's the Patils. Yeah, the Patels.
Yeah. Are they twins? They were twins, right? Yeah. And
Dean Thomas. Lee Jordan, thank you. Yes, we're going to crowdsource this answer.
Kingsley Shacklebolt.
Yep. But we can name them on one hand.
The wizarding tournament the foreigners, wait, what are they, French and German? From the foreign wizarding schools?
And they're so exotic.
So apparently our acceptable representations of people of color are not as actual people. It's not even just that there's no actual portrayal of actual racism and white supremacy if it's supposed to be set kind of in the real world. But where are the non-white people? Where are we? I have this nagging sense that if I went to at least some cons that are focused around Harry Potter, that I would feel very, very misplaced. And I'm a light-skinned East Asian, but like there's not many of us. Where are we? So the question of relatability is not just, does this person exist? Is it representation? But how? Yeah. Whether it's through presence or through absence. And that's something that's very important to me to pull out.
Yeah, we in the first episode of the podcast, we were talking about the representation of the goblins in the Harry Potter world, who are moneylenders with large noses and dark skin
and claws.
And we were like, okay, so this is like an over-the-top anti-Semitic trope. And we sort of spent some time saying, well, let's give Rowling the benefit of the doubt back in the day when we were inclined to give Rowling the benefit of the doubt. I feel less so inclined now for reasons.
I'm a cynical pessimist.
Yeah.
Join the asshole club.
Yeah.
I've got a lifelong paid membership.
Well, also I think the Magic in North America thing, which we can get into later if you want to, but that moment indicated to me that when Rowling actually has members of a community speak back to her and say, we don't like what you're saying about us, she doesn't do a great job of managing it. But we struck a deal in that first episode that we would recognize that the goblins are not in fact the Jews of the wizarding world if there was an actual Jewish person in the books. To which a whole sea of listeners responded, "There's one.
Just wait for it.
Just wait. He's 4 books away, and there's one of him, and he's in the background of one scene."
And then we find out that there are actually 2 more who come out in the movies later, who are his grandmothers.
Yeah. So his grandmother is going to be in Fantastic Beasts and their locations, and so that's it. So there's like one Jewish woman from the 1920s, and then her grandson in present day, and that's it, 2.
Did you know that was all the Jews in the entire world?
That's it. The UK doesn't have other Jews in it. So, okay, the point that Marcelle was making reminds me quite a bit of the conversations that were happening really recently around Rowling's unsurprising revelation that Lupin's werewolfism was intended to stand in as a sort of allegory for HIV and AIDS, which for those of us who read the books closely, and for most queer readers, was something that was already quite readily apparent, right? Lupin is already a character who's really heavily coded as a gay uncle. He's single, he's sort of an embarrassment to the family. People don't trust him around children. So when the truth of his identity comes out, he has to be taken away from the children. He has a contagious disease that he got via a pedophilic act done to him as a child by a man. Like, the coding was already very heavily there. So when Rowling said, yes, in fact, that was what I was going for, many of us were like, yes, no, we know. But thank you. It's like at least she's validating the reading as opposed to saying, Sirius Black. No, so straight. But this comes. I just saw somebody make the same point you did, which is, why isn't there HIV and AIDS in the wizarding world? Like, if you want to have a character who represents the stigma associated with being gay and being HIV positive, then just make a character gay and HIV positive. You don't have to make him a metaphor for that.
Why are we having to implicitly read all the queer characters? So apparently, if wizards are a thing, supposedly around the world, not a single one is openly queer. 0 of them are openly queer. Okay. Excuse me while my suspension of disbelief breaks.
Mm-hmm. Or as Tumblr would say, Harry just doesn't notice because it's not part of his journey.
Right. True.
Yeah. So I want to add into this, let's take Lupin a little further and think more about the implications of using a metaphor of monstrosity to talk about being gay and being HIV positive. The moment when that revelation took place was when Rowling released some new short stories that contain additional back material about some of the canonical characters. And I want to read you just a sentence from that, which is the description of what happened to Lupin when he was attacked. It said, "Shortly before Remus Lupin's 5th birthday, as he slept peacefully in his bed, Fenrir Greyback forced open the boy's window and attacked him." And that, in a nutshell, so entirely points to the problem at the heart of this allegory, which is that Lupin becomes an exceptional werewolf insofar as he rises above the situation, like what has happened to him. But his werewolfism is linked both not only to being a victim of violence, something that was, forced on him against his will, but is also linked to this intense moment of the stigmatization of gay sex, the equating of the gay figure in the person of Fenrir Greyback with pedophilia, with violation, with the image of sneaking in a window while a child is asleep is a powerfully violent image. And if that's what we're given textually to think about how we should stigmatize gay men less, I'm not convinced that that's an effective way. Even if we agree that using those kinds of allegories is okay, I'm not convinced that that's an effective way to do so.
One thing that reminds me of is a lot of the rhetoric around trying to get federal and state funding to look into medical treatment and services for people living with HIV and people with AIDS back during the AIDS epidemic. And the Ryan White bill came about in part because of rhetoric about Ryan White as an innocent victim of AIDS. That was the language that was used to sell the bill to finally win it passage, that Ryan White was an innocent victim of AIDS. And what that rhetorical device tells us is that, like you just said about Lupin, Ryan White was an exceptional person with AIDS. Ryan is an exceptional one. And that the majority of people who have HIV or who have AIDS, it's your fault for it. It's an indication of a moral problem with you, which is part of the moralizing and the villainization of being queer. And so what you're talking about, that's what that makes me think of, is where's the history in the United States where we live, right? Well, I live, you don't. You live across the border, but it's close enough, right? Well, where I live...
It's also there. Whatever you're about to describe is also there.
I'm sure. I mean, Canada is also a settler colonizer state taking over Indigenous people's land, so...
Boom.
There's, that much in common. But... that's what it calls to mind for me, is that rhetoric of how the Ryan White bill was passed. That the bill did create funding that has been incredibly useful for many people, right? And many queer people in particular. But how it had to be done, and I say had in a very loose sense of that term, I don't think that is how we ought to ever try to force gaining more resources or challenging oppressive systems, is through throwing people under the bus. But theoretically what we had to do to get that bill passed was to paint some people as, well, they're okay because they're the good ones. You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of the racism. And I can be told you can be a good person of color because you're light-skinned, and if you shut up about racism, then you can be a good person of color, and we can use you as our great token. So Lupin can be the good gay person because he doesn't give in to the animalish, savage tendencies of being a werewolf. Well, that language is not just incredibly stigmatizing and ableist against people living with HIV or AIDS, it's racist language. Even though Lupin is a white character, I'm not saying that people are being racist against Lupin. I'm saying that what this comes from is racial concepts. That's what I'm saying that comes from. Yeah.
And ultimately, in order to be a heroic figure, Lupin needs to be reinstated into this heteronormative reproductive order, right? That he needs a female partner, he needs to have a child, he needs to sort of be brought back under control, and then he can be a good guy.
One point that I would like to make, not in J.K. Rowling's favor, this was probably accidental on her part, but in terms of a kind of way to resist the activity of Lupin's marriage to Tonks is that Tonks is an animagus? Hard G or soft G?
What is she?
Metamorph magus. Right, because Sirius is the animagus. God, okay. Sorry.
She's a shape changer?
She's a shapeshifter. All of which is to say that the one positive, not heteronormative way to read their relationship is that we cannot possibly presume what their sex life is like because there are so many exciting possibilities. So that is the one thing.
My favorite reading of that relationship is like, why would any of you assume that she only takes like
one form,
gendered forms?
Yeah.
Like, she can be anything.
But then to complicate my own point, and we have talked about this in the podcast before, there's also zero textual evidence that Lupin wants to be in a relationship with Tonks, and there is in fact a ton of textual evidence that he does not want to be in a relationship with Tonks. And so it is also at the same time very easy to read that relationship as an attempt on his part to, big scare quotes, fit in to normative society and belong to normative society.
So basically, Tonks is his beard.
Yeah.
Oh, and she could turn into a beard.
She can grow a beard.
Might be taking it a bit far. Marcelle, will you talk to us about squibs?
I can talk to you about squibs. So Lydia set this up really nicely earlier on in talking about the ways in which the autistic community typically finds itself represented in literatures. And Harry Potter is a really good example of the ways in which disability gets mapped onto really problematic stereotypes. And so what I had done is I had pulled out 3 key examples. There might be more that are not coming to mind, but the 3 key examples are Argus Filch, Arabella Figg, and Ariana Dumbledore, who all have a lot in common with one another, but in particular, they're what I think you could boil down to unlovableness. And Ariana is a little bit of an exception because she was young and she's remembered very lovingly and fondly because she was a child when she died. But both Mrs. Figg and Argus Filch are presented to us in the books as being kind of gross.
As assholes.
Yeah, like assholes. Mrs. Figg is, she, like, when Harry stays with her, when the Dursleys go away, she has to make sure that he's miserable so that he's allowed to keep coming over, which is, I guess, forgivable, but also, like, you'd think that they could have had some kind of bargain, like, I'm going to give you cake and we're going to be friends, but just don't tell the Dursleys, tell them that you hate it. And he'd be like, cool.
And that's revealed a lot later on, too. That's not revealed up front anymore.
Yeah, definitely not. But Argus Filch is for sure a really great example of a, like, heinous, vile, sort of Igor kind of character who, like, lives in the dungeon, who is a real penchant for torturing children. Like, that's what he really wants out of his job. He's gross. He has a cat. Both he and they both have cats because, as we know, unlovable people only have cats.
There's an undergrad thesis in there for somebody. Squibs and cats in Harry Potter.
So one of the things that really struck me, so when we were first sort of emailing about what it is that we would talk about on this panel, and Lydia had sent a really thoughtful list of the different characters and the ways that we can read them in terms of having different kinds of disabilities, I was really taken aback by how vile the representation of magical disability is in the Harry Potter books. And going back to Filch, for example, one of the only moments of sympathy that we have for him is when Harry is, for some reason, in his office. I can't remember the details, I'm sure some of you do, and like sees Filch's, like, pamphlets for basically, like, snake oil. It's basically like whatever, like, something that you can buy to learn how to do magic. And you have this moment where you feel sympathy, but what you actually feel is pity. You don't feel empathy because he's not a person who all of a sudden you can identify with. It's not like, I also wish that I was a wizard. It doesn't feel like that. Instead, it's sort of like, oh, here's a pathetic old man who really is so hateful in so many ways, but you can pity him because he was born different and it's not his fault. And that's not an adequate representation of disability. None of these characters are an adequate representation of disability. Similarly with Ariana Dumbledore, we get a sense that she was, or rather, like, her representation is different in the sense that she was made magically disabled by being attacked by some Muggle boys, and that's very vague. We're not entirely sure what happened there.
Again, linked to sexual violence, right? Again, sort of this important traumatic moment where the person is a victim of something terrible done to them, and that justifies the way they are.
And so we understand that she was never the same, but that never being the same is not read as lovable in a different way. It's never was the same, all of a sudden becomes the family secret that gets hidden away. And her attack, the knowledge of her attack, is used as evidence that she wasn't a squib. So it's not that she was born this way. This is something that happened to her. It wasn't her fault. And the whole thing is bad. It's bad.
You know, another aspect, just listening to you talk about this and thinking about it, right, from histories, particularly as an autistic person, is the use of applied behavior analysis and its history with O. Ivarlovas, who is known for his work on the Feminine Boys Project, which was federally funded to try to look at how can we target boys that are not displaying conventionally heteronormative masculine behavior, so they seem feminine. And that means we think they're at risk for becoming homosexual. And how can we stop them from being feminine so they won't become homosexual? And the techniques he used in that study, in that research, he transferred over to autistic children. This was some of the early research on conversion therapy, right? And the first boy, whose name I honestly can't remember, and I feel really awful about that, who was in Ivarlovas' research, he touted for decades, and in some textbooks is still listed as a successful case. When he was in his 30s, he killed himself. And so for autistic children, right, we grow up being taught, like, whenever we find out that we're autistic, and there are a lot of racial and gender disparities in who gets identified when. I say identified because diagnosis is very medicalizing. I don't like that. But who gets identified when there's a lot of disparities along racial and gender lines. And people considered girls get diagnosed a lot later. People who are Black or Latinx get diagnosed a lot later. And when that happens, it becomes this thing of you can't be what you are. You have to become neurotypical. You cannot flap. You cannot rock. You have to make eye contact and basically not become autistic anymore. Like, it was even said to me at one point, oh, when you go to college, hopefully you won't be autistic anymore. And, I'm thinking, like, okay, so, maybe in like a few years I won't be queer anymore too. And maybe by the time I die, I will finally become white, damn it. I will finally become white. I will reverse Rachel Dolezal, but as an Asian. And that's what that makes me think of with Argus Filch, is it's not just, it's the pity, it's that, he's trying really hard to be the better kind of person. That he's not, but he's really just a defective wizard. That's what he is. He's a defective wizard. And that's what that calls to mind.
This is reminding me of some of the really excellent scholarship done by fantastic Canadian feminist literary scholar Helen Hoy, who towards the end of her career decided that she was close to retirement and that she would just make it her job to just like piss people off. And she also at the time, and still, had recently begun caring quite a lot for I'm forgetting the details here, but had a very close family member with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so she became very interested in the problem of FASD and the problem of diagnosing FASD, because in order to successfully diagnose it, you have to be able to confidently say that the mother was drinking during pregnancy. And the government is very comfortable assuming that, for example, Indigenous women, whether they admit to it or not, were probably drinking during pregnancy. And so FASD diagnoses are much higher in the Indigenous population than they are, for example, in white middle-class populations, where it may in fact also have been the case, but the sort of assumption that white women are automatically better mothers means that the diagnosis rate is lower. And because it is so frequently undiagnosed, Helen started to go through particularly narratives of childhood and find characters who were treated as problem children and talk about those narratives as FASD narratives and what that does for our sort of understanding, for a sort of destigmatizing of neurodivergence in literature. And she got in the national newspaper for suggesting that Anne of Green Gables might be an FASD child, told that she was betraying her nation, essentially. But it does become when you start to actually think about the politics and the history around diagnosis, then there starts to be something really subversive in finding those narratives in the characters who aren't supposed to be like that.
Another aspect of that with fetal alcohol syndrome is fetal alcohol syndrome, spectrum disorders, and reactive attachment disorders. When they are identified in children in white middle-class households, it's often adopted children of color. I am a transracially and transnationally adopted East Asian child of color into a white middle-class family. And there was a lot of contention when I was in middle school over, was I autistic or did I have reactive attachment disorder? And it was actually explicitly said. What was explicitly said was, we think, misgendering me, of course, we think that she has reactive attachment disorder because she was abandoned in an orphanage before she was saved. So just more racism seeping into this. I can talk about white supremacy all day long, but I think I've hit my quota.
Should and must.
I think I've hit my quota of pissed off white people today.
That's,
I was just going to add, just for an FYI, that a friend of ours who is a nurse once told me that actually in white households, the children with, how did she word it? She said that ADHD is much more commonly diagnosed among white children, even though they have the same symptoms as FASD, and so that is one of the ways in which racism plays out. And again, ADHD is one of those things that you can say to the parents, "It's not your fault. You couldn't have done anything." Whereas FASD is you are a bad person, you are a bad parent, you are not white.
Yeah. So, I want to bring this back a little bit. Maybe as we're wrapping up and thinking about opening up to questions, I want to bring this back a little bit to the question of the role of metaphor or allegory in the Harry Potter books, right? And what it does for you, both the incredible value of these fantasy stories in which the sort of non-identity of the world we're reading with our own opens these spaces for us in which we can start to find ourselves where we don't find ourselves in other texts, opens these spaces where we can also in really important ways read our whatever's happening in the world right now into them. And sort of holding on to that value even while we hold on to the critique at the same time, right? I mean, this is a thing we say over and over again about Harry Potter and about all readings, is that you have to be able to critique the thing you love. You have to be able to push back against it and say, it could have done better. We're going to keep insisting on better, even while we read these books and are comforted by them and love them. And I think that problem of the way that all of our protagonists in Harry Potter are white characters who are metaphors for marginalized experiences is one of the really key ways we need to push back. Because I find myself in the midst of the resurgence of white supremacy and white nationalism, which people of color know never went anywhere, but is becoming very painfully obvious to everyone right now.
You mean painfully obvious to white people?
Painfully obvious to white people, yes.
Let's be really specific. It's not painfully obvious to us.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right? It's like, for whom is the current political scenario surprising? Only for those...
Only white people.
Only white people. Yeah, so in that moment, I think it's incredibly important to look at a text that normalizes whiteness and allows, sort of recenters whiteness as a default identity that can then itself become a metaphor for experiences of marginalization that are real, right? Which is to say that there are people of color at Hogwarts. You didn't have to use a metaphor for black people. There are black people at the school. You didn't have to use a metaphor for indigeneity. There are indigenous people in this world. Rowling made that really clear to us. So what is the role that metaphor is playing?
Yeah, one thing that this is making me think of is an essay that came out a year ago by an Asian American novelist, also an East Asian. I cannot remember his name, and now I feel more bad that I'm just not remembering names today. I had a law exam today. I'm just going to use that as my excuse. And he wrote an essay about how he'd written a novel that was very widely acclaimed when it was published, and it was a novel in which his characters, he's an East Asian guy, and his main characters were black people who were living at the time of chattel slavery in the South, and he's not from the South, and he's obviously not black as an East Asian who is not mixed race. And the criticism he got wasn't primarily from black people, it was from white people who were saying, oh my God, it's so stunning that you wrote about people that are not Asian. And so the essay he wrote about, and I haven't read the book, so I don't know, and obviously I'm not black, so I can't speak to what anti-blackness feels like. So I don't know if the book was problematically anti-black in any way. But the essay that he wrote was about the backlash he got from white people, white literary critics, saying that it was basically this amazing, stunning thing that he wrote about people that were not like him. And this normalizes how white people like J.K. Rowling write about people all the time who are not white people and win prizes for it. Like, you win prizes for it, like, if you're in blackface or yellowface on TV. You win prizes for it, like, if you are a white non-disabled person getting up and playing a disabled person in the movies. You win, like, an Oscar for that.
Or you're a cis man and you play a trans woman and you win an award for it.
Yep, you're cis men and playing trans women, or straight people playing gay people. But usually it's white people in all these categories. It's white person who is then also playing this additional marginalized experience. And so white authors are treated as cosmopolitans. Like, white people get to be omniscient narrators. Like, white people are able to learn about and write about characters that are different from them if they choose, and they'll get an award for it because, oh my God, you wrote about someone different. And then when writers of color, like this East Asian guy, writes about someone who does not share his racial experiences, suddenly it's like this stunning revelation. So for me as an East Asian writer, I'm working on yet another novel manuscript now, where the characters are a variety of racial backgrounds. Some are East Asian and some are various other races, other people of color or white, other sexual orientations than mine, other genders than mine, other disability statuses than mine. I know that I'm going to get that kind of criticism of, like, oh my God, you wrote about people that don't have your experience? As though as an East Asian guy, or for me as an East Asian person, we can only write about East Asian characters, but white people can write about anybody. White people get to be the experts on everybody, but I'm only allowed to speak from my experience as an East Asian person in fiction. And I'm not saying that we don't have a responsibility to try to avoid writing fucked up things in our fiction, like, we're talking about, but that somehow only white people are allowed to do this and usually get away with all of it because white people excuse them. And that's something that I think we need to bring that into the conversation, right? Is that how white people are allowed to be the experts on everybody, and anyone that's marginalized, a person of color, disabled, queer, we're expected to only be able to ever write about people who have our exact same experiences. In disability world, we call that the self-narrating zoo exhibit. I'm expected to be a personal educator for everybody, just about my individual experiences with being autistic. And I'm not allowed to talk about anybody else's experiences of being autistic, even from this is what people have told me, this is what in the community we know to be true for a majority of people. I'm not allowed to talk about that because I can just talk about my personal experiences and leave the philosophy and the politics to the experts, AKA the non-disabled people.
It reminds me of how readily the literary community will accept autobiographies written by people of color, and especially written by women of color who have experienced, like, extreme violence. We love those books because they, like, allow us to feel like we're really learning about other people because it's autobiographies. But if you ask somebody who reads this kind of, like, these types of books. Like, can you recommend any good novels by, like, queer people of color? Or could you name for me an author that you recommend that I read who is not a white, able-bodied Western person? And they can't think of any, but they will have, like, a handful of autobiographies that they've read recently that are so great. That's what that was making me think about.
Yeah. The functioning in the confessional mode, that thing. Yeah.
You know, one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about, like, since I realized we've now been talking for like an hour.
For so long, I'm so sorry. I was like, how long could we possibly go? We'll go to questions really quickly.
I want to talk about a couple
too
things.
Interesting.
Is that a compliment?
Yes.
Okay. Wait, you said that a little hesitantly.
No, it was definitely a compliment.
Okay. Well, you know, my exam today was in evidence, and in evidence, we talk about the reliability of witnesses' statements. So, two things that I wanted to really hit on before we open up for questions and answers was one of the explicit portrayals of disability is Voldemort. In two ways. Voldemort is supposed to be read to us as a psych-disabled person, almost the trope of the lone wolf, read white male, school shooter kind of person who grows up to be this evil bad person because he wasn't loved enough, and also through physical disability, through how he looks. He's portrayed like in this long history of portraying the villains as having a deformity or some kind of a physical disability. I mean, look at the James Bond, the movie that came out in 2012, the one Skyfall. The villain played by the Portuguese actor, I cannot remember either the actor or the villain's names.
Was it Javier Bardem? Was he the villain in that movie? Yes. I ask you about Harry Potter, you have all the answers. I ask you about James Bond, you all look at me like I just invented it.
So Javier is that villain in that movie. This is recent, right? Very recent. Has missing teeth, and all of his mouth has become deformed, has acquired a cosmetic disability because of a past attack that he survived, and that's part of his key personality as this villain. Like, we see that with the Joker in Batman, has both of those aspects, like with Voldemort, someone who's supposed to be read as this person's psychologically unstable and physically deformed. And so Voldemort is just another representation of how it's when it becomes whiteness. See, white people and even sometimes other people of color will say, oh, well, white people get off on being evil because they can say it's not really their fault because they have a mental illness. And really, that's just ableism. When you can't target a white person because of racism, because if the person was black, Latinx, or was racialized as being Muslim, we know what we would call them if they were the bad guy. But if it's a white person, it's like, oh, well, we can't put you into the racial box since you're white. Let's go to ableism instead. Let's use ableism instead. And so the person isn't getting off. All that we're getting is a horrible caricature that results in real harm to actual disabled and neurodivergent people, especially the ones that are actually people of color, who are the most likely to be targeted by police, who are the most likely to be locked up, who are the most likely to be taken out of school, over the assumption that when you occupy a body that is racialized and made disabled in a criminal way, that because of your race and because of your disability, or our assumptions about your race and your disability are criminal, then you are the most at risk. And that brings me to the other thing that I wanted to make sure to talk about, which is the complete lack of critique about what Azkaban represents. Azkaban represents an extreme form of solitary confinement, where even as this is explained in the narrative, is that the, I just blanked on the name for Dementors. That's what they're called. Law school. All the information comes in and it chucks everything else out. The Dementors are serving as guards because they suck the life and the joy out of the people inside. And that if you are sentenced to receive the kiss from a Dementor, then you basically don't exist as a human being anymore. It's another image of the ableist idea of a vegetable, almost, that you're not really a person anymore because what makes you a person will be taken from you. And what, for me, is irresponsible about this is that it doesn't show the people who would actually, in the real world where Harry Potter is supposedly based, actually be swept up into a carceral system in Azkaban, who are suffering, is that it's narratively written as, well, it is really these really bad people, the worst of the worst, and the ones that we know of that are named are people who are either actually really bad people or who are falsely believed to be really bad people, like with Sirius. And in the real world, in the real world, as hopefully you all know, and if you don't, my God, where have you been living? The mass incarceration in the United States and the history of incarceration and institutionalization, actually in both the US and Canada, right, disproportionately in vast numbers targets Black people, followed by Latinx and Indigenous people. And the numbers that I've heard from other disabled advocates and activists, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, is that somewhere between 50 and 70%, depending on which number you're using, of all people that are incarcerated are disabled or deaf, which means that the vast majority of people disproportionately who are locked up and shut out in society are Black folks who are also disabled or deaf. And this is not acknowledged anywhere. So that is the cut of people, not people who look like me, people whose brains might be like mine, but not people who look like me, who are subject to the torture of solitary confinement. And that's the irresponsibility of Azkaban to me, is that it represents something that was, it's inhumane because it was some bad people who maybe something bad should happen to, but not because of what it did to people psychologically. Not because of the creation of new disabling experiences through trauma and through torturing how somebody's brain functions. Whether you're disabled or not when you come in, you're likely to leave with a disability. And the real world, it can't sit around waiting for some people to say, let's look for this critique. The real world is spinning on right now, and real people are suffering and real people are dying. And when the fictional representation of something that actually takes people's lives on a daily basis is not written in a way that accounts for that reality, that's a problem. That's a problem for me.
Okay, let's thank you for that. I would really love to open this up and have you add into this conversation, ask us to speak more on points, introduce other things you would like us to talk about that we haven't touched on yet.
I made an entire list and I didn't get to everything.
Okay, so.
Hi. So this sort of goes back to what we were talking about with ableism a little bit, but as we were discussing Neville Longbottom and his parents, I was thinking, because I remember after Harry returns to his dorm, he often got pity for being an orphan, but thinking about it, he thought that Neville actually deserved their pity more. And so I kind of was hoping you could talk about how this world of Harry Potter is constructed in such a way that people who are suffering from who have disabilities or are suffering from mental illness their fate is seen as worse than death. And there is no evidence of any form of mental health care within the Harry Potter world. And I was wondering if that was something we could talk about, because that deserves to be talked about.
Yeah, so very real things. One thing is, even just, not to just stick you under the hotlight, but just how rhetorically the fear of, not just, the pity is related to fear. You can't separate them. The fear of disability is embedded into the popular imagination, is the assumption that if you have a disability, you must be suffering, right? So not to stick you in the hot seat, but right, that this is what you've just said. And this is normal. The statement you just made is how we, on an average daily basis, encounter descriptions of disability, especially mental illness, is someone who suffers from it. The assumption that to have a disability is a fate worse than death. Here's how that plays out in the real world. In the past couple of decades, over 400, something like 450 disabled people have been murdered by their family members or caregivers that we know of. Because many times it's not reported in the news. If it is reported, the fact that it's potentially wrongful death is not included, that it was suspicious, or that the person had a disability might not be reported. This is what we know about. Over 400, 450, right? And in every single one of these cases, the narrative is the same. The narrative is the parent or the caregiver truly loved this person, but they snapped from the stress of the burden of having to take care of somebody with special needs. That language is also ableist, because it says our needs are somehow this burdensome thing in capitalism and ableism that other people's needs aren't. And that therefore it's sad and tragic that they killed this person that they were supposed to care for, but it's understandable. You need to walk in the parent's shoes because you don't know what it's like to have to live with somebody like that. This is a real consequence. Here's another real consequence. In the conversation around whether or not physician-assisted suicide should be legalized or not legalized, in research that was done on the topic of people who were surveyed who said that they would consider choosing assisted suicide, the number one reason that people indicated, so statistically, the number one reason that people indicated was that they were afraid of becoming a burden on their family members or their loved ones. And so it wasn't even so much, I am experiencing severe pain and suffering, but I am afraid that I will be. And that's why I think I would like for this to happen. And so here's a disparity. Regardless of whether we believe that, you should be able to choose to kill yourself or not, when someone says I'm feeling suicidal because I'm queer and I'm being bullied, or someone says I'm feeling suicidal because I'm the only kid of color in my school, or I'm feeling suicidal because I've just survived a very sexually violent act, usually our reaction as a community is to say, how can we help you? How can we support you in not committing suicide? That's usually the response. And narratively, in the popular imagination, and actually how we talk to each other, if someone says, I'm thinking about killing myself, or I'd rather kill myself than end up a vegetable, we usually say that's the brave and heroic choice. Because who wants their body to be like that? This is the real world consequences, that disabled people get killed by their family members, and disabled people are more likely to feel pressured into choosing death and not offer the same suicide prevention that we would assume should be offered to other people. Regardless of whether we decide societally, should we allow people to choose to kill themselves or not, there's a disparity in how we apply that, right? And so the idea that to be disabled is worse than to be dead has real world life and death consequences on actual disabled people. Like there's one of the reasons that Autism Speaks is so hated is that about 10 years ago, in one of their public service announcements, which they've never apologized for, their vice president at the time is on video saying that she thought about sticking her autistic kid in a car and driving off a bridge. But the only reason she didn't was because she had another child, Reed, non-disabled, she had another child who'd be waiting for her at home. In the video, you can look up this video, it's still on the internet. The autistic kid who is able to understand what she's saying, this kid was like in middle school or something at the time, not like a 2-year-old, like able to understand her, is sitting in the room as she says this. They've never apologized for this video. The idea that you can speak about us as though we're not here because we basically might as well be dead because, at least if I was dead, there'd be an end to it. But if I was alive and like you, then I wouldn't really be there. That has real world consequences. And so you raise a really great point, that why is it that what happened to Neville's parents is seen as, should be something more pitiable than what happened to Harry's parents? It ties into this ableist narrative, that disability is a fate worse than death. And that comes directly out of ableism.
I was wondering if we could talk about the potential of Voldemort being read as a queer character.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that?
Sorry?
Did you want to take that first?
Sure.
I saw your thoughts moving.
Yeah. So one of the ways that this has come up a handful of times what we've talked about in the past is the ways in which Voldemort's asexuality is being read as violent and a reflection on his villainy. Right? So his kind of particular effeminacy, he's not the kind of villain who is a big scary man who takes many wives in that kind of sexual predator way. He's a sexual predator in the fact that you are not afraid he's going to sexually assault you. He is his asexuality is seen as what makes him deviant and creepy and disturbing and really fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. So there's two things at work there, right? There's, on the one hand, you can read Voldemort as a character who is in some way coded as queer. There's, because there is this way that Tom Riddle is this sort of sexualized, in some ways effeminate character. And then we have the way that Ralph Fiennes chooses to portray Voldemort in the movies, which also has this sort of, I don't even know how to get at it. Strange sexuality to it, Sure. But one of the vets, I'm going to come to regret that. But that's one of the ways that we've come back to him as a character is around this idea of his sort of failure to fit into any recognizable forms of sexuality. That is to say that he reads in a lot of ways as an asexual character, that he is as a sex-repulsed asexual character in particular, that he is uninterested in sexuality, and that his sex repulsion becomes just part of his villainy in a way that implies, again, that asexuality is other, that it is perverse in some way, that it is unrecognizable in a sort of, a protagonist or a recognizable character. And that's something that really got driven home, I thought, in people's responses to, Cursed Child, spoiler alert, plug your ears for a second. The presence in the Cursed Child of the child of Voldemort. And so many people I heard coming back and saying, like, well, that doesn't make any sense because, like, Voldemort would never have a child, and making jokes like, does he even have a penis? In this way that sort of ended up really playing into the we code Voldemort as a villain by coding him as lacking in a recognizable sexuality. So that I have been finding has even been coming up more now that we've actually been forced via this new canonical piece of the narrative to think about Voldemort having sex. All of a sudden, like, a whole bunch of people freaked out in a way that I thought was pretty indicative of where the thinking was at around Voldemort as a character in the first place.
I think adding to that, right, is that asexuality as an asexual person is often used as this, it's evidence that there's something wrong with you. And that's why not obviously every single one of us, but for many of us in asexual spaces, we claim queerness because if our asexuality, right, is treated as this deviant thing, that means there's something wrong with us that we have to be forced into. It's not just a heteronormative ideal, it's a heterosexual normative ideal. Then it comes with the same kind of baggage that other queer people who are sexual experience: invalidation, dismissal, erasure, being told that we can't possibly understand our bodies or know what our bodies are like or what our bodies want or what our bodies feel, being subjected to sexual coercion and to control of who we are. And so for me, like what you're bringing up, the assumptions that the comments that people make, does Voldemort even have a penis? Like, this is also something that is hyper masculinized and like incredibly anti-trans, that if you have a penis, it's an indication of being an actual man and of being the heterosexual normative man, someone that is worthy of respect, and that as a villain that we have to find a way to attack him not for what he does and what he believes, but for the kind of body we think he has. And that's fundamentally problematic, because if he's a person that occupies a place of a lot of privilege, what about the people who don't occupy that place of privilege, who are going to be faced to an even more amplified version of this body shaming and this hypermasculinity and the enforced, the deviance attributed to asexuality? That's what that brings up for me.
Hello. So previously when you talked about, I guess, the werewolfism being a metaphor for HIV and queerness, how does that change sort of the implication of, Sirius setting up Snape to be attacked by Lupin, but then James saves him?
Whoa.
Yeah.
I'm out of here. That's what, okay, so.
Good question.
That's just that was great. Right, so that, let's say we are reading Lupin right here as being a queer figure. So that ties into the image of Sirius setting up Snape to get attacked by Lupin as a sort of reinforcement of the figuring of homosexuality. And I'm using like gay and homosexual intentionally here because I want to be specific about the kinds of tropes that are being rendered in the representation of Lupin, that they're not queer tropes writ large. They're very specific, like gay male experiences. So that reinforces the image of it as being predatory, as being sort of foisted on people in an unwanted way, right? That sort of Snape becomes available to that victimization. But I think that it also just reminds us of how much homoeroticism, queerness, desire there is latent in the entire set of relationships between Snape and Sirius and Lupin and James, and how it is so clear to me as a reader that there's this really sort of dense backstory between those characters that has a lot to do with desire and with relationships that are not unfolded for us, which is why, again, I referenced in passing a reader asking Rowling, is Sirius gay? And Rowling saying, no, absolutely not. And how very strongly a certain portion of the Harry Potter fandom responded to that, because that reading of like Sirius and Lupin as being in love with each other and people who can't be together because of this whole set of scenarios, which also takes the piece of the narrative that you're talking about and makes it complicated and messy and weird, but in maybe productive, interesting ways, to have her foreclose that so authoritatively. And I know authoritatively she's the author. I know she's what she does. She like authoritatively states things by definition. But to foreclose that possibility seems to take a whole piece of the novel that I think is really exciting for many of us who are queer readers and just be like, no, you can't do it. Well, people are only gay if I say they're gay, and only Dumbledore is gay.
The one gay and not even out canonically.
Yeah, and who, P.S., looks just like everybody else, because that is Rowling's final statement on queer characters, that they are unrecognizable in their queerness, right? You know that famous tweet that she wrote, like, you know, you didn't notice Dumbledore was gay because gay people just look just like everybody else? It's like, no. I'm sorry, the face I'm making doesn't translate well to an audio medium. I apologize, listeners. I'll send you a picture.
As you were talking about diversity and the problem of when world building a fantasy novel and having people in the real world who are, you know, differently abled or something like that, and have it being transferred into, you know, fantastical creatures is a problem. I just remembered that the actor who plays Professor Flitwick also plays Griphook, and those are the only two little person-speaking character roles in the entire series, at least, that is represented in the movies. And why did they double cast him and nobody else? It's not that hard. It's Harry Potter.
Yeah, it also suggests like we're willing to hire one non-normatively bodied person, but only one, and that person has to be a prop in every circumstance. Yeah, so I can't take credit for this because this is the point that a friend of ours, our friend Neil, made about the ways in which non-normatively bodied people function as props, in exactly what you're saying with Flitwick and with the goblins in Harry Potter. And it's one of those things where in the way that the world is constructed, it's not that there are people with bodies that are different shapes and sizes. It's that there are people who are either part, in Hagrid's situation, for example, where Hagrid is part giant, and that is why he's so big. And with Flitwick, I think it's implied somewhere that he has some kind of like magical creature blood somewhere.
Part goblin? Yeah, he's part goblin.
Part goblin, yeah. So it becomes in this world impossible to perceive that there might just be like different shapes and sizes of bodies among non-magical creature humans, which is like, again, goes back to that perspective where the stories are presupposing a white normatively and able-bodied readership and viewership, and attempting to teach that readership and viewership how to imagine other people existing in the world without having space to value difference, and instead are like, but look at the ways in which we are the same. That is where we bond. Our differences don't need to be meaningful. It's the ways in which we are the same.
It's the trope that we have in disability community of, oh, you're trying to get your 5 gold stars for not being an asshole. And that is what we somehow want, the privileged, powerful, dominant people. So that's the lesson we want them to learn, is that if I don't say a slur and I occasionally hold a door open and I think about what are words that might be offensive and eliminate all of the words that could possibly be offensive from my vocabulary and stop there, then I'm a good person. Instead of changing our material reality, the violence in language is part of a broad pattern of violence, and invisibility and erasure is part of that.
Yeah, sort of to add to that, also thinking about like the idea, or rather like the myth of the good white person in Harry Potter, and like how that sort of like absolves especially the trio of any moral responsibility or personal responsibility for any of the things that are happening in the book that we read as allegories for race and racism and white supremacy, and like I can only speak from being a white reader, but like as like a white child reading the book, like the message is that these things are bad, but it's also not your responsibility to do anything about it, because like you're a good white person if you, as you're saying, like get these words out of your language, or like acknowledge that something wrong is happening.
Yes.
So I have a completely unrelated question.
Great.
So just thinking about like the actual school of Hogwarts and how it's set up, and how like J.K. Rowling writes about it, of like people either have natural ability at like things like when Harry gets on the team and he's the best flyer ever, and you're like, seriously? Like, or in their classroom, right? Of like how people learn, and like the lack of support for 11-year-olds who are starting boarding school for the first time, and like academic support. You can tell I'm a teacher and this is what I am fixated on. I was wondering if you had thoughts about that, of like how characters are portrayed as intelligent or unintelligent. Yeah.
Can you repeat louder and more clearly the very last piece of what you just asked, how something intelligent or unintelligent?
How students are, Hogwarts are considered intelligent or unintelligent.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have an auditory processing disability. The acoustics of this room are terrible, and if I can't see your lips clearly, I do not understand what you're saying, which is a wonderful part of my hidden disabilities, and by wonderful I mean sometimes horridly inconvenient. I guess one thing, yes.
Can I add one more thing to my question?
Sure.
The other thing I think about, as in my classroom, I'm trying to make speech to text normalized so that everybody can hear and take notes in a more comfortable way and write papers, is the technology. Why does everybody not have a quick quotes quill to help them take notes, or to help like give visual cues to students of what teachers are saying? That seems like a great idea.
Yeah. A really short answer, because I've been talking a lot, I feel like, is that one thing that I didn't talk about as much is how many folks that are disabled in different ways, but particularly learning disabled people, really glommed on to Neville Longbottom as a disabled character, written as somebody who clearly has some type of a learning or a cognitive disability and is struggling academically in a way that is familiar to many of us. And that, again, that falls into that category of here's an implicit representation instead of one that is explicitly named, and the implicit representation did actually a halfway decent job, whereas the explicit ones are very lacking, to put it nicely. And I think one of the things that, like you say, is not actually pulled out is that people learn differently and are struggling in different ways, because we really only see a handful of examples. There's actually, if I recall correctly, and someone correct me if my memory of this is wrong, law school has checked a lot of things out of my brain, is that the two, firstly, there's Dudley Dursley, and then there's the two kids who follow around Draco Malfoy, whose names I don't remember.
Crab and Goyle.
Them. I missed that because auditory processing, because the Crab and Goyle, thank you. So, yeah. So Crab and Goyle and Dudley Dursley are all basically, as I remember it, portrayed in this trope of the dumb, stupid kid, who like is the dumb, stupid, fat kid, very specifically. Thank you for reminding me of that piece too. And that fatness and disability have to go together, and that if you're a bully, it's because you're dumb and fat and stupid. And other than those examples, and Hermione as being this genius kid, and Neville as a kid that's really struggling and also sort of falls into the fat and stupid genre, but not a bully, are the only real representations we have that, like, not everybody learns the same way. Like, we don't know if everybody else is more or less doing the same or not. We only get glimpses of what grades people get when they take their owls and their newts, and we otherwise don't really know. And we don't know how people are doing in the classroom much at all beyond those examples. And that makes me just think, the answer to that is fan fiction, clearly. More fan fiction.
I just want to point towards two other sets of characters. So Fred and George, I think, are really wonderful. I know, right? And who we often fail to spend enough time on in the podcast, even though we both love them. But Fred and George, the baby's crawling. Focusing out. The baby was being cute. I apologize. Fred and George are characters who are represented throughout the first half of the series as being bad at school. And that's what we know about them. They are, they're badly behaved. They obstruct the learning experience of others. And once they leave school, which they do voluntarily at an early age, there's this revelation that they're in fact incredibly talented wizards, who were deeply unserved by the schooling system at Hogwarts, and that as soon as they are placed in a scenario where they are allowed to sort of govern their own learning experience, they become these sort of prodigies, right? And even Hermione, who is like the great voice of institutionalized education, says when she first goes into their new joke shop, she says, like, this is really sophisticated magic. And she's surprised because she assumed that because they didn't do well at school, they must be bad wizards. And so that's, a little moment that we're given to show us that, yeah, actually Hogwarts is not serving everyone. And then the other interesting thing, I think, is to remember that Luna is a Ravenclaw. And that most of our interactions with Luna as a character are about her being flighty, and about her believing things and having, understandings of the world around her that from the perspective of our narrator are incorrect and silly, and, obviously her being, a lunatic, to draw on the origins of her name. But Luna is in the house for people who are deeply intellectual. And so I think there's a space in there as well to think about how Luna also models for us a different way of being smart. And so I think there's little bits in there to say we are shown that Hogwarts has hey guys, this is a revelation. There are some failings in the pedagogy modeled at Hogwarts. Yeah.
I think one of the other issues with the Fred and George example that you point out is the narrative is saying, oh, it's okay because they really are smart in the end. And it's still placing a value on some conceptualization of smartness or intelligence, which at its core is actually pretty ableist, by saying that, okay, well, if we're going to challenge it a little and say academic success isn't the only way to prove that you're smart, but they're okay because they still proved they were smart. And I think that's another bit of the issue.
Yeah, that's really important as well. The actual idea of having characters who are just not smart characters but are still like valuable, intriguing, well fleshed out, fully realized characters is something that the series gives us no space for.
I mean, there's the idea that Neville redeems himself at the end, but like it's because, oh, so you did something that someone who was more or less cognitively neurotypical could have done, and therefore you proved you were a valuable person by engaging in armed combat. But like prior to that, we all just assumed you were a dunce, literally, for the whole series, that you're the slow kid. So for us as disabled kids, it's the kid that was also on the short bus, also taken out of the classroom and taken to the special ed resource room. And that's, that sort of plays into the exact same thing.
Hi, I just have a question about Hagrid and his being mixed giantism and wizard, but then also his having an umbrella with which he has his wand in it, which has been broken. It's not clear if it was broken to stop him from performing magic or it was broken somehow other, but I want your comment about that, his disability not being able to perform magic and being mixed race and his hiding of his magical ability.
It's fascinating that Hagrid is this character who is our one-half giant and also can't do magic, right? Yeah. Can't do magic, but actually can do magic, but has to hide it, and also hides it in this object that's wand-like, but not quite a wand. So what's happening?
Okay, now that I think I sort of understand the question, so one thing I want to comment, I am 100% East Asian. I'm not a mixed race person, but as an East Asian person of color, I've definitely heard from other East Asians and from other people of color, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and mixed race, of the phenomenon of having to hide that we're smart, or of having to hide that we're skilled at something because it's 20 times as threatening to the white men that dominate basically every academic field than even if a white woman shows it. Like, white women, I've heard, will say things like, oh, I have to try to dumb myself down in order to be, like, not treated as, like, a threat or something. And for many people of color, that's 20 times worse, regardless of gender. But then it's worse if you're a woman of color or a non-binary, feminine-presenting person of color. And that's what your comment just brings out for me, right, is that something that is treated as a desirable trait or as a trait indicating value or worth in a white person, particularly a white man, has to be tamped down or hidden. If it's a woman, particularly a woman of color or another person of color of a different gender. And that because it becomes more scary and destabilizing to a white supremacist patriarchy, and that's what I'm thinking about. As far as the broken wand thing, my reading when I read through the books for the very first time was that his wand was broken to stop him, to punish him for being who he was and being able to use magic, and that he was never allowed to take it up again.
That being expelled from Hogwarts in essentially the third grade was supposed to essentially stop him from participating in the magical community and essentially impose upon him a magical disability. And I think that Hagrid is a really fascinating example of that we didn't really talk about ahead of time in the ways in which he represents disability and like a neurotypicality, because he is read and positioned as different and as other in a number of ways with our main protagonists, and like at the same time the ways in which he is represented as being monstrous are always being balanced out with his extreme gentleness and kindness and really interesting forms of presenting femininity. So like the fact that he has an umbrella but that it's a polka dot. It's a polka dot umbrella. It's a pink umbrella, but doesn't it have polka dots?
Yeah.
I want to sit next to you doing that.
Anyway, it does. The point is, we all know that it's pink, and the fact that he wears a frilly apron when he is cooking, and the fact that when he adopts a dragon, he calls himself Mummy. So there are ways in which Hagrid performs a kind of like very familial, affectionate, loving, feminine presence that is, I think, in a lot of ways supposed to tamper what would otherwise be seen as his monstrosity, because he is a big, scary, hairy man who does not read as intelligent in the ways that Hogwarts wants us to perceive intelligence, and has been kicked out of school, and so hasn't been allowed to learn in an institutionally mandated kind of way, and has had to kind of like make his existence. And you really have to ask yourself, like, what could Hagrid have done if Dumbledore hadn't hired him to be the groundskeeper of Hogwarts? Like, he's not allowed to get an education, and everything that we have come to learn about the way that the Magical Society works is that you get jobs based on your grades, and your grades are determined in your owl year and then in your newt year. And then you go on and do some kind of apprenticeship. So if he's kicked out of school, anyway. And I think another thing that's really fascinating, and maybe goes back to what Lydia was saying earlier about disability and incarceration rates, is that Hagrid is also one of our few protagonist characters who has spent time in jail. And so I think what's happening is we're seeing a lot of different intersections of oppression happening in a single character. He's still represented as white, though, except not in the production of The Cursed Child, which is a really interesting casting choice, which we can talk about afterwards. But anyway, going back to my point, is that he remains a white character, or is sort of represented as a white character who becomes a metaphor for all of these other forms of oppression, instead of there just being these other kinds of marginalizations existing in the world, I think is what I'm getting at.
It's instructive but still problematic.
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
And I mean, one of the things in which it's instructive is how men of color, particularly East Asian men, South Asian men, okay, every kind of man, black men, Latinx men, are subject to white supremacy, and the white gaze is through feminization, as though being made to be feminine or effeminate is taking away from your masculinity, which is both patriarchal and white supremacist. I think if you had a comment to make, if it was very short, we can probably take it because it's not 8:30 yet.
I do. Okay.
I was just wondering how participating in this podcast and like doing these panels has changed your own methods of pedagogy. So yeah, I just want to hear that.
You're a teacher now.
Yeah. Yeah, I am a teacher now. That's my job. Okay, so here's my number one favorite thing about what the podcast has taught me about teaching, which is that teaching works 150% better when it is based around the presumption that every student in the room with you brings forms of expertise, embodied knowledge, experience, learning that are not yours and that are as valid to whatever you're doing in that classroom as what you know and what you're trying to teach them. And that if you assume I am the possessor of knowledge and you, the people before me, are those who are not possessed of knowledge, and my job is to somehow get what's inside my brain to go and be inside your brain, that's going to work for maybe 2 students, no matter the size of your classroom. And those 2 students are probably going to be students whose parents went to university, who are middle class, who are probably white, who have been set up in all kinds of ways to learn under very specific scenarios. But that if you come into the space and say like, okay, so here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to get out of this time we're going to spend together. What do you want to do? What do you want to get out of this? What do you already know coming in here? What matters to you in the conversations that we're going to have? Then all of a sudden you get to have a sort of collective experience of learning and unlearning. And that's hard for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that classrooms are such coercive spaces that you can't single-handedly undo the learned behaviors that students have acquired from years and years of being told to sit still and not talk and write down everything you say because you're standing at the front of the room. So there's a ton of collective unlearning that has to happen. But having this podcast where we share our readings of Harry Potter with a listenership of people who have read Harry Potter way more than we have and way more carefully, and also bring into their readings, as everybody does, a whole set of experiences that are not ours and a whole set of knowledges that are not ours, means that we are constantly shaken out of the position of expertise, out of the position of being the knowers, and put in a position instead of conversation. and as a result have learned, I think, just a ton more from not presuming that we're the ones who come in knowing in the first place.
I would say that is true. I agree. I think that another thing that doing the podcast and these books have taught me is that there are a variety of ways in which you can use literature to talk about things that are happening in the real world and connecting with people. But the main thing is that as an instructor, I try to remember that my class is not necessarily the most important thing in these students' lives, that they may be like dismantling the patriarchy outside of the classroom, and that if they haven't done the reading, that shouldn't be my problem, and I don't need to lose any sleep over it. Maybe they're doing something better.
I think I've been on a podcast exactly once before this, and it wasn't about Harry Potter, but as a professor for the first time, I've taught classes before, but never to college students. This is the first time for me. I have learned that basically both as a student and as a professor, there are some things that will always suck. And that as a professor, I am just as bad a procrastinator as I am as a student. And my students who are in the room now know what I mean by that. And I will not comment further.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to propose that we wrap up. I know that we're not quite at 8:30, but I think we would all love to just get the opportunity to carry on the conversation and meet some of you. So thank you all so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks to my absolutely delightful and brilliant fellow panelists. This was really, really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us for episode row of Witch Please. All episodes can be streamed live from our website, ohwitchplease.ca, or downloaded using the podcatcher app of your choice. We'd like to send our biggest, most enthusiastic thanks to the folks who made this episode possible by reuniting us all the way across the continent in Boston. Thank you, organizers Emma and Elise. Amazing, so enthusiastic. Judy and Bobby and the whole Tufts podcasting network. It was so great to hear your work. And especially Lydia Brown for sharing the stage with Marcelle and Hannah. If you'd like to learn more about Lydia's work, we've included a link to their website on our website. Marcelle and Hannah are going to try really hard to see fantastic beasts and where to find them this very fortnight. But will that be the next episode? Only time will tell. So until next time, do. Later, witches.